Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow, very gentle stroll back in time all the way to ancient Rome. Now, picture this. You're a high-ranking senator, draped in your finest toga, making your way through the bustling forum. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meats, the murmur of 1,000 conversations, and the distant shouts from the gladiatorial arena. Sunlight glints off marble statues, and you can practically feel the weight of history pressing down on you. But then you spot him. The Emperor. And he's not just wearing any old toga. Oh no, he's shimmering, almost glowing in what appears to be silk. Head to toe, and not just a little silk, but all the silk. You probably won't survive the sheer uncomfortableness of it all, let alone the political intrigue. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Always curious to see how far these sleepy stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story tonight centers on one of Rome's more colorful characters, Emperor Elagabalus. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, he ascended to the imperial throne at a mere 14 years old, in 218 AD. Now, for most Roman emperors, the fashion brief was pretty clear: noble, dignified, and distinctly Roman. Think sturdy wool, perhaps some linen, and maybe a touch of purple dye, if you were truly important. But Elagabalus, he had other ideas. Many other ideas. His particular fixation, the one that would raise more than a few senatorial eyebrows and probably cause a few patricians to clutch their pearls, was silk. Not just a casual silk scarf, mind you, but an all-encompassing daily wear, floor-length, shimmering, rustling, impossibly expensive silk wardrobe. You might imagine him wafting through the imperial palace like a human butterfly, leaving a trail of gasps and hushed whispers in his wake. Now, for a bit of mainstream history to ground us before we drift off. The Roman Empire at this point was a vast, sprawling entity, stretching from the chilly climes of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of North Africa. It was a civilization built on order, on law, and, ostensibly, on a certain degree of Roman gravitas. Emperors were meant to embody this gravitas, to project strength and stability. Elagabalus, however, seemed determined to project, well, something else entirely. His reign, though short, was marked by a series of unconventional, to put it mildly, choices. His silk obsession was just one facet of a personality that defied and often deliberately provoked traditional Roman sensibilities. Think of it as the ultimate act of teenage rebellion, but with an entire empire at your disposal. Here's a quirky little tidbit for you. While Elagabalus was known for his love of silk, he also reportedly enjoyed hitching wild dogs to a chariot and riding through the streets of Rome, which one can only imagine must have been quite the spectacle. Silk robes flapping in the wind, canine chaos ensuing. Makes his fashion choices seem almost tame in comparison, doesn't it? It suggests a mind that enjoyed disruption, that reveled in the unusual, and found profound joy in simply doing things differently. Historians still argue whether his actions were purely capricious, born of youthful excess, or if there was a deeper, perhaps even religious motivation behind his often shocking behavior. His very name, Elagabalus, comes from a Syrian sun god whose cult he championed, and some scholars believe his fashion choices were intertwined with his religious zeal, an attempt to bring a more opulent, Eastern aesthetic to the staid Roman pantheon. Regardless, his insistence on being draped in silk, day in and day out, was a radical departure from imperial norms, a shimmering statement of defiance in a world that prized conformity. You can almost hear the collective sigh of the conservative Roman elite Now, you might be thinking, what's the big deal about a bit of silk? And that's a perfectly reasonable 21st century question. But cast your mind back to ancient Rome. This wasn't a world of fast fashion or readily available luxuries. In fact, Rome had very specific ideas about who wore what and when. These were known as sumptuary laws, and they were basically dress codes enforced by the state. Imagine if your local city council dictated whether you could wear jeans or only linen trousers on Tuesdays. Sounds a bit much, right? But for the Romans, these laws were about maintaining social order, distinguishing the plebs from the patricians, and ensuring no one got too flashy for their own good. These sumptuary laws were quite strict, dictating everything from the width of the purple stripe on a senator's toga to the number of rings a citizen could wear. The idea was to prevent excessive displays of wealth, maintain moral rectitude, and ensure that the traditional Roman virtues of frugality and simplicity weren't completely forgotten in a sea of exotic silks and glittering jewels. So for Elagabalus to swan about in head-to-toe silk wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a defiant, almost revolutionary act. It was like showing up to a black tie gala in a neon pink tracksuit. Except in ancient Rome, the consequences could be a tad more severe than just a few disapproving glances. You could be fined, publicly shamed, or even worse. The very fabric of Roman society, pun intended, was at stake. Here's a mainstream historical fact that puts Elagabalus's fashion sense into perspective. During the Republic and early Empire, even the most prominent Romans, like Cicero or Augustus, largely adhered to a relatively modest dress code. Their power was projected through their rhetoric, their military prowess, and their lineage, not through outlandish garments. Their togas were symbols of citizenship, not fashion statements. So for Elagabalus, a mere teenager, to actively flout these established norms was seen by many as not just a personal quirk, but a direct attack on Roman tradition itself. It felt like he was mocking the very foundations of their society, one silken swish at a time. And now for a quirky tidbit, one of the more peculiar sumptuary laws even extended to funeral rites. There were regulations on how much food could be served at a wake, and even how many musicians could play. Imagine trying to explain that to a grief-stricken family. Sorry, you've hit your loot quota for the dearly departed. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained the concept of regulated modesty was in Roman life. Elagabalus's silk fetish, therefore, wasn't just breaking a fashion rule, it was violating a deeply held cultural expectation about appropriate public behavior. It was truly a textile rebellion. Historians still argue whether the sumptuary laws were truly effective in curbing excess, or if they merely served as guidelines that the wealthy often found ways to circumvent. But what is clear is that Elagabalus made no attempt to skirt them quietly. He wore his silk with a flamboyant disregard for public opinion, almost as if daring anyone to challenge him. You can practically hear the collective gasp of the toga-clad populace as he floated by, a shimmering anomaly in a world of practical wool and linen. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, fashion could be a powerful tool of defiance, a way to signal your disdain for the status quo, especially when you're the emperor. You might be cozy in your bed now, but imagine the stiff, scratchy wool most Romans had to endure while Elagabalus was enjoying the silky embrace. Quite the contrast, isn't it? So, where did all this fabulous silk come from? The answer, my sleepy friend, lies far to the east, in the mysterious and ancient land of China. Silk production was a closely guarded secret, a jealously protected monopoly that the Chinese had perfected over centuries. Imagine a world where only one country knows how to make chocolate or how to brew coffee. That was the power of silk. It was more than just a fabric. It was a symbol of wealth, of exoticism, and of almost unimaginable luxury. The process itself was quite remarkable. tiny silkworms munching away on mulberry leaves, spinning their delicate cocoons. These cocoons were then carefully unwound, sometimes requiring miles of thread to produce just a single garment. The result was a fabric unlike anything the Romans had ever seen, smooth, shimmering, and impossibly light. It felt like wearing a cloud or liquid moonlight. No wonder Elagabalus was hooked. Here's a mainstream historical fact for you. The Romans knew about silk long before Elagabalus. It had been trickling into the empire for centuries, mostly as a luxury import for the very wealthy. But it was incredibly expensive, often worth its weight in gold. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of haute couture, only even more exclusive. It was a status symbol of the highest order, a way to flaunt your wealth and connections to the far-flung corners of the world. And now for a quirky tidbit. The Romans had some pretty wild ideas about where silk came from. Some believed it grew on trees, like some sort of exotic wool. Others thought it was harvested from a kind of sea creature. The reality of tiny silkworms was so far removed from their experience that they invented all sorts of fantastical explanations. It's like imagining that your favorite coffee beans are grown on the moon. The truth was far more intricate and far more fascinating. Historians still debate the exact routes and methods by which silk reached Rome. The most famous pathway, of course, is the Silk Road, a network of trade routes stretching across Asia. But there were also sea routes and overland paths through Persia. The journey was long, arduous, and fraught with danger. Think bandits, treacherous terrain, and months, even years, of travel. It's a testament to the allure of silk that merchants were willing to brave such perils to bring it to the Roman market. You can almost feel the weight of history in every shimmering thread, the echoes of countless journeys, the whispers of far-off lands. And you, my friend, are about to embark on your own little journey, a journey into the silken world of Emperor Elagabalus. Now, imagine yourself a trader, perhaps an Armenian merchant, standing at the edge of the Gobi Desert. The sun beats down, relentless, baking the very stones. The wind whips up eddies of sand that sting your eyes. Before you lies a vast, shimmering expanse of nothingness, stretching for days, weeks even. But somewhere beyond that, a fortune awaits. This is the Silk Road, not a single paved highway, but a sprawling, interconnected web of routes, camel tracks, and mountain passes, stretching thousands of miles from the heart of China to the Mediterranean coast. The gentle hum of the Silk Road wasn't exactly gentle in the sense of quiet. It was a hum of creaking cart wheels, the rhythmic plod of camel hooves, the chatter of merchants haggling in a dozen different languages. You'd hear the distant call of a caravan leader, the jingle of bells on a camel's harness, and perhaps, if you were lucky, the faint, haunting melody of a flute, played by a traveler trying to ward off the vast loneliness of the desert nights. Imagine the smells, too, not just dust and sweat, but the exotic scents of spices like cinnamon and pepper, fragrant teas, dried fruits, and, of course, the distinctive aroma of raw silk bales, which probably smelled a bit like damp earth and mothballs, if we're being honest. It wasn't all roses and perfumes, you know. Here's a mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. While silk was the most famous commodity, the Silk Road was also a conduit for so much more. Ideas, technologies, religions, and even diseases traveled along these routes. Buddhism, for example, spread from India to China, largely along the Silk Road. It was a superhighway of cultural exchange, far more impactful than just a fancy fabric. Think of it as the ancient internet, connecting diverse civilizations in ways previously unimaginable. And now for a quirky tidbit. Sometimes when passing through particularly desolate stretches, traders would report hearing strange, ethereal music or disembodied voices, often attributed to desert spirits or demons. These were likely caused by the wind whistling through rock formations or the sound of shifting sand dunes, creating a haunting hypnotic effect. So if you were a lonely merchant far from home, these ghostly sounds probably didn't help you drift off to sleep. In fact, they probably made you clutch your camel a little tighter. Historians still argue whether the Silk Road was primarily driven by demand from the west or supply from the east, or if it was a more complex interplay of various regional economies. What's certain is that it fostered a remarkable degree of interdependence between distant cultures. The desire for silk in Rome fueled the vast network of trade and travel that stretched across continents, bringing untold wealth to some and unimaginable hardship to others. You can almost feel the gentle rock of the camel beneath you, the vast starry sky above, as you make your slow, deliberate journey, carrying precious cargo towards a waiting empire. It really was a marvel of ancient logistics, all for a bit of shimmering fabric. So, you've imagined the vastness of the Silk Road, the endless journey, and the whispers of distant lands. But what happened once those precious bales of raw silk finally arrived in the Roman Empire? This is where the magic and the arduous labor truly began. Weaving the imperial dream wasn't a quick process. It involved skilled artisans, often enslaved individuals or highly specialized craftspeople, transforming those delicate threads into the luxurious fabrics that would eventually grace the bodies of Rome's elite, and of course, our silk-obsessed emperor. Imagine a large workshop, perhaps in a bustling Roman city like Alexandria or Antioch, which were major hubs for exotic imports. The air would be thick with the scent of natural dyes, rich purples from murex snails, deep reds from madder root, vibrant blues from indigo. You'd hear the rhythmic clatter of looms, the soft rustle of threads, and the focused murmur of the weavers as they meticulously worked. This wasn't automated factory production. It was painstaking handcraft, each inch of fabric a testament to incredible patience and skill. To produce a single large garment like a toga or a tunic could take weeks, even months, of continuous work. Now imagine that for Elagabalus, who seemingly wanted to wear a new silk outfit every day. The demand must have been astronomical. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Roman dyeing techniques were incredibly advanced for their time. They could produce a dazzling array of colors, and certain shades, like the Tyrian purple, were so intensely difficult and expensive to create that they were reserved almost exclusively for emperors and high-ranking officials. The process involved harvesting thousands of tiny murex sea snails, extracting a minute amount of dye from each, and then a complex series of chemical reactions, often in vats that smelled, shall we say, less than pleasant. So when Elagabalus wore his silk, it wasn't just the fabric itself that screamed luxury, but often the very specific, incredibly costly color it was dyed. And now for a quirky tidbit. Some Roman texts describe certain dyes as being loud or soft, referring to their visual intensity. So you weren't just wearing a color, you were making a statement about its volume. Elagabalus probably preferred his silks extra loud, perhaps even shouting. One could imagine him demanding the loudest possible shades of purple or gold, truly assaulting the visual sensibilities of the more understated Romans. He certainly wasn't going for a gentle whisper with his wardrobe choices, was he? Historians still argue whether the Romans ever truly mastered sericulture, the actual raising of silkworms and production of raw silk, or if they remained entirely dependent on imports from the East for their raw material. While there's some evidence of very limited attempts at sericulture in later Roman and Byzantine times, for Elagabalus's era, the vast majority, if not all, of the raw silk threads would have come from far-off China. This dependence on a distant exotic source only added to silk's mystique and incredible value. You can almost feel the softness of the woven fabric, cool against your skin, a world away from the scratchy wool of everyday Roman life. It was truly an indulgence beyond compare, a tactile testament to global trade and ancient craftsmanship. Now, we've established that silk was a dazzling, expensive, and exotic import. But for many traditional Romans, it wasn't just an extravagance. It was a scandal. Imagine you're an old-school Roman, perhaps a stern-faced senator who's seen a few emperors come and go. You pride yourself on your gravitas, your seriousness, your commitment to the virtues of the Republic, even if the Republic is long gone. Then along comes Elagabalus, shimmering in silk. This was beyond mere fashion. This was an affront. Roman discomfort with silk stemmed from several deeply ingrained cultural biases. Firstly, it was seen as terribly effeminate. Roman men, especially those in positions of power, were expected to be robust, manly, and austere. Flowing, translucent silk was considered the attire of women, and even then, only women of questionable repute. For a male emperor to wear it openly, let alone exclusively, was a shocking display of perceived weakness and a subversion of traditional gender roles. It was like seeing a hardened general show up to battle in a ball gown. The very thought would send shivers down a conservative Roman spine. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Roman society placed an immense emphasis on virtus, a concept encompassing masculine virtues like courage, discipline, and moral excellence. Dress was a visual representation of virtus. A simple, sturdy toga conveyed these qualities. Silk, on the other hand, was associated with softness, luxury, and the decadent East, everything that virtus was not. So Elagabalus wasn't just dressing differently. He was, in the eyes of many, dressing wrong. And now for a quirky tidbit. Some Roman moralists even complained that silk was too revealing. The fabric was so light and fine that, especially when damp, it could cling to the body and reveal the wearer's form. This was considered scandalous, particularly for men. So, while Elagabalus might have felt divinely inspired in his silken robes, many of his subjects probably thought he looked vaguely indecent, as if he'd forgotten his underwear. Imagine the whispering campaigns in the forum. Did you see what the emperor was wearing today? You could practically see his ideas. Historians still argue whether the Roman disdain for silk was purely about moral fiber, or if there was an underlying element of xenophobia at play, as silk came from distant, barbaric lands. Regardless, Elagabalus's fashion choices alienated vast swathes of the Roman elite, solidifying their view of him as an un-Roman, even dangerous figure. You can almost feel the stiff, judgmental gazes following him as he glided through the imperial halls, a silken anomaly in a woolly world. It's a classic case of cultural clash played out in the most luxurious fabric imaginable. So, with the background set, the exorbitant cost of silk, the arduous journey from China, and the conservative Roman distaste for such ostentation, let's finally delve into the heart of the matter. Elagabalus's daily wardrobe. This wasn't just a preference, it was an all-consuming obsession that defied every expectation of imperial decorum. Forget the sturdy wool togas. Elagabalus was a walking, shimmering testament to excess. Imagine waking up in the imperial palace, the morning light filtering through elaborate tapestries. Instead of reaching for a simple tunic, you, as Elagabalus, would be presented with a dazzling array of silken options. We're not talking about just one silk outfit for a special occasion. We're talking about an entire wardrobe, changed multiple times a day. Sources suggest he never wore the same garment twice, an environmental nightmare even by ancient standards. Each outfit would be custom-made, likely in vibrant, loud colors that scandalized the traditionalists. Think rich purples, shimmering golds, vibrant blues, perhaps even shocking greens, colors that would have stood out starkly against the more muted tones of everyday Roman dress. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Unlike earlier emperors who might occasionally wear silk for specific ceremonial purposes, or as an undergarment, Elagabalus wore silk as his primary outer garment, consistently and publicly. This was his signature look, the visual embodiment of his reign. It was a clear rejection of Roman sartorial tradition, a very public statement of his exotic tastes and his disdain for conventionality. He didn't just bend the rules, he shredded them into silken ribbons. And now for a quirky tidbit, it's said that Elagabalus even had his servants and guards dressed in silk, turning the imperial court into a veritable fashion show. Imagine the logistical nightmare of sourcing, manufacturing, and maintaining such a vast, constantly changing, and impossibly delicate collection of clothes for an entire retinue. The imperial laundry bill alone must have been legendary, assuming silk could even be laundered in ancient Rome without utterly ruining it. Perhaps they simply discarded everything after one wearer. A truly terrifying thought for anyone who appreciates a good thread count. Historians still argue whether his extravagant wardrobe choices were merely an expression of personal excess, or if they were part of a deliberate strategy to associate himself with the opulent Eastern cult of Elagabal, the sun god whose priest he was. Whatever the motivation, his daily wardrobe was a constant, visual reminder of his unconventional reign, a shimmering provocation to the Roman elite. You can almost hear the soft rustle of silk as he moved, a sound utterly alien to the marble halls and woolly dignity of Rome. It's a reminder that sometimes the most mundane things, like what you choose to wear, can become a powerful symbol of rebellion and cultural upheaval. Elagabalus's silk obsession wasn't confined to his personal attire. Oh no, that would be far too modest for our flamboyant emperor. His love for shimmering fabrics permeated every aspect of his imperial life, especially his lavish banquets. Imagine being invited to dinner at the palace, expecting marble and gold, and instead finding yourself immersed in a silken wonderland. This was imperial dining in silk, where even the mundane act of eating became an extraordinary, shimmering spectacle. Picture this. You arrive, perhaps a nervous senator, ushered into a grand dining hall. But instead of the usual austere Roman decor, every surface seems to shimmer. The couches you recline on for dinner aren't just cushioned, they're probably upholstered in the finest, softest silk, perhaps dyed in a shocking shade of purple or green. You lean back, and the fabric whispers against your toga. The very air around you feels different, softer, more decadent. It was an environment designed to overwhelm the senses, to transport guests into Elagabalus's unique, silken reality. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Roman banquets, even without Elagabalus's additions, were already elaborate affairs, often lasting for hours with multiple courses, entertainment, and copious amounts of wine. Food was served on ornate platters, and guests reclined on triclinia or dining couches. Elagabalus, however, took this opulence to an entirely new level, adding layers of silken luxury to an already extravagant ritual. He transformed a feast into a theatrical performance, with silk as the star of the show. And now for a quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest that Elagabalus not only adorned the couches and walls with silk, but he also had his banqueting tables covered in it. Even more bizarrely, he reportedly served food on dishes made of, or lined with, silk. Imagine trying to eat a plate of roasted peacock or dormice, a Roman delicacy, believe it or not, off a silk tablecloth. The logistical nightmare of cleaning such items, or the sheer waste if they were discarded after a single use, is mind-boggling. It certainly put a new spin on fine dining. One can only hope the food didn't stain too badly. Historians still argue whether these accounts of his extreme excesses were entirely factual, or if they were embellished by later, hostile sources eager to paint him as a depraved tyrant. Regardless, the persistent anecdotes about silk permeating his banquets highlight his reputation for unparalleled extravagance and his blatant disregard for traditional Roman values of moderation. You can almost feel the soft, cool silk beneath your arm as you reach for another grape, the gentle rustle of your fellow diners' silk robes, all contributing to an atmosphere of almost surreal luxury. It was dining elevated, or perhaps debased, by the very fabric of excess. Elagabalus's devotion to silk wasn't limited to his daytime wardrobe or his opulent dining experiences. Oh no, our emperor believed that the embrace of silk should extend even to his most private moments, particularly when seeking the blissful oblivion of sleep. This takes us to the world of perfumed and pillow-soft imperial chambers, where silk wasn't just a covering, but an entire environment designed for the ultimate in relaxation and indulgence. Imagine you are Elagabalus, finally retreating from the demands of the day. You step into your private chambers and immediately the air changes. It's thick with the sweet, heavy scent of exotic perfumes, frankincense, myrrh, rose, and perhaps even some of the more elaborate concoctions Romans were famous for. The light is soft, filtered, perhaps by silken drapes, and then your eyes land on the bed. It's not just a bed, it's a silken sanctuary. Every surface is probably covered in silk. The bed linens, of course, would be the finest, softest silk, impossibly smooth against your skin. Imagine sinking into a mattress piled high with silken cushions and pillows, each one plump and yielding. The drapes around the bed, designed to keep out drafts and prying eyes, would also be of silk, perhaps embroidered with elaborate patterns. The walls themselves might even be draped with silk tapestries, muffling sound and adding to the feeling of being cocooned in luxury. It was an environment designed not just for comfort, but for sensory overload, a gentle, silken embrace that promised a truly imperial night's rest. Or perhaps a slightly too warm, slightly too clingy night's rest, depending on the Roman climate. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Romans, particularly the wealthy, were quite fond of perfumes and incense, using them not just for personal adornment, but also to scent their homes and public spaces. They burned aromatic resins, used scented oils, and even had perfumed fountains. So the idea of a perfumed chamber wasn't entirely novel, but Elagabalus undoubtedly took it to an extreme, combining it with his silken fetish to create a truly unique sleeping experience. And now for a quirky tidbit. Some historical accounts suggest Elagabalus slept on a bed stuffed with rabbit fur and rose petals atop his silken sheets. Imagine the combination: the delicate rustle of silk, the soft give of the fur, and the ephemeral scent of thousands of crushed rose petals. It sounds incredibly luxurious, but also perhaps a little itchy after a while, and certainly a magnet for any local Roman insect life. One can only hope he had a dedicated team of staff to replace the petals daily. That's a job description you don't see on LinkedIn these days. Historians still argue whether such extreme levels of personal luxury were truly unique to Elagabalus, or if other emperors also indulged to similar degrees but managed to keep it more private. What is clear, however, is that his reputation for excessive, almost absurd, opulence was profoundly linked to his obsession with silk. You can almost feel the gentle breeze from a window stirring a silken curtain, the soft scent of roses lulling you into a deep imperial slumber. It was a bedroom truly fit for a man who believed himself to be a living god. Elagabalus, not content with merely swathing himself and his private chambers in silk, sought to extend his peculiar aesthetic into the very fabric of Roman public life. This was his audacious attempt to infuse silk in Roman public life, taking a private indulgence and trying to make it a public spectacle, much to the chagrin of the traditional Roman elite. Imagine the grand public ceremonies, religious processions, triumphal parades, senatorial meetings. These events were steeped in ancient tradition, with specific dress codes and rituals designed to convey solemnity, gravitas, and the enduring power of Rome. Now, picture Elagabalus attempting to introduce silk into these hallowed proceedings. Perhaps he'd insist on silken banners being unfurled, replacing the sturdy wool and linen standards. Or perhaps he'd try to dress the priests of his beloved sun god Elagabal in shimmering silken robes, an unthinkable affront to the established Roman pantheon and its more restrained clergy. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Roman public life was rigidly structured and symbolized by very specific attire. Senators wore togas with broad purple stripes, equestrians with narrower ones. Priests had their own distinctive robes. These garments were not merely clothes, they were uniforms that visually communicated status, role, and adherence to tradition. For Elagabalus to attempt to inject silk into these highly symbolic realms was not just a fashion faux pas, it was an act of political subversion, a deliberate blurring of lines that Romans held sacred. He was essentially telling everyone that their old ways were, well, a bit drab. And now, for a quirky tidbit, it's reported that Elagabalus even tried to force senators to wear silk during official meetings, a move that would have been met with open outrage, if not outright refusal. Imagine a room full of grumpy elderly men, used to the comfort and familiarity of their heavy wool togas, suddenly being told to put on something so lightweight and, to their minds, effeminate. You can almost hear the grumbling, the uncomfortable fidgeting, and the indignant whispers as they tried to maintain their dignity while feeling utterly ridiculous. It would be like asking a group of grizzled army generals to attend a strategy meeting in tutus. The resistance would be palpable. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's attempts to introduce silk into public ceremonies were truly about aesthetic preference, or if they were a calculated move to further integrate his Eastern religious practices into Roman society, as silk was often associated with Eastern priestly attire. Whatever his deeper motives, his efforts were largely met with resistance and ridicule. The Roman public, and especially its conservative elite, were simply not ready for a silken revolution. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief when he was finally gone, and the reassuring, scratchy familiarity of wool returned to the public sphere. It was a battle of fabrics, and in the end, traditional Roman textiles won. As you might well imagine, Elagabalus's relentless pursuit of silken opulence and his blatant disregard for Roman tradition did not go unnoticed, nor was it particularly well received. In fact, it fueled a growing tide of discontent, leading to significant resistance to silken rule. The Roman elite, accustomed to a certain decorum and traditional values, found his behavior not just odd, but deeply offensive and dangerous to the stability of the empire. Imagine being a patrician, a member of one of Rome's ancient, venerable families. You've been brought up with stories of Cincinnatus, the farmer-turned-dictator who saved Rome and then promptly returned to his plough, embodying the virtues of simplicity and duty. And here stands your emperor, a teenager from Syria, prancing around in clothes that would make a courtesan blush, demanding that even sacred rituals be performed in fabrics from far-off lands. This wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was a perceived assault on everything Rome stood for. The murmurs would have grown louder, the disapproving glances harder, and the plotting more intense. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus's reign was remarkably short, lasting only about 4 years, from 218 to 222 AD. This brevity was largely due to his extreme unpopularity with the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, the imperial bodyguard, and even the common people. His unconventional religious practices, his bizarre personal life, and yes, his scandalous fashion choices, all contributed to a widespread perception of him as an unfit ruler. The silk, was just the highly visible tip of a very large iceberg of imperial misconduct. And now for a quirky tidbit. One of the more peculiar acts of defiance against Elagabalus reportedly came from the common soldiers of the Praetorian Guard. While they were meant to be utterly loyal, the sources suggest they grew weary of his excesses and humiliations. Imagine these hardened legionaries, used to tough discipline and practicality, being forced to stand guard while their emperor hosted a banquet where guests were pelted with rose petals from the ceiling, all while he shimmered in silk. It's safe to say their morale wasn't at an all-time high. It might not have been a full-scale mutiny over silk, but it certainly added to the boiling resentment. Historians still argue whether the resistance to Elagabalus was primarily driven by genuinely held moral objections, or if it was more about political maneuvering and the desire of powerful factions to replace him with someone more amenable to their interests. Regardless of the precise blend of motives, his silken indulgence became a powerful symbol of his perceived unfitness to rule. You can almost feel the tension in the air, the collective holding of breath, as the powerful figures of Rome weighed their options against this strange, silken emperor. It was a slow-burn rebellion, quietly simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Elagabalus's audacity wasn't limited to merely dressing himself in silk or adorning his banquets with it. Oh no! Our intrepid emperor, in his boundless enthusiasm for his new Eastern-inspired cult, even attempted to force his fashion choices onto the most sacred and revered figures in Rome, the Vestal Virgins. This truly was the Vestal Virgins' silken shame, an act that would have sent shivers of horror down the spine of every traditional Roman. Imagine for a moment the Vestal Virgins. These were not just any women. They were the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, whose sacred fire was believed to be inextricably linked to the fate of Rome itself. They lived lives of unparalleled chastity, purity, and devotion, taking vows for 30 years. Their traditional attire was a simple, pure white woolen stola and palla, symbolizing their innocence and dedication. This was a uniform that had remained unchanged for centuries, a visible beacon of ancient Roman piety. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Vestal Virgins held immense power and prestige in Roman society. They were immune from patriarchal control, could own property, and their word carried significant weight. Any offense against them was considered a sacrilege of the highest order. For Elagabalus to even suggest they abandon their traditional humble wool for shimmering, exotic silk was an act of profound disrespect, bordering on religious desecration. It was like forcing a monk to trade his habit for a sequined jumpsuit. And now for a quirky tidbit. Elagabalus, in his zeal to merge Roman and Syrian religious practices, reportedly forced a Vestal Virgin, Aquilia Severa, to marry him. This was an unthinkable act, as Vestals were forbidden from marriage, and any breach of their chastity was punishable by being buried alive. While the sources don't explicitly state he forced her to wear silk for the marriage itself, given his overall obsession, it's highly likely he would have attempted to dress her in something equally outlandish and un-Roman, adding insult to profound injury. The thought of a pure Vestal Virgin, adorned in what many considered a decadent, effeminate fabric, would have been enough to cause widespread revulsion among the populace. Historians still argue whether his actions towards the Vestals were a deliberate act of provocation to undermine traditional Roman religion, or if he genuinely believed he was elevating them by associating them with his own opulent cult. Regardless of intent, it was a move that deeply alienated the Roman people and the Senate. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath, followed by a slow, simmering outrage as news of this sacrilege spread through the city. The Vestals, pillars of Roman piety, were now being subjected to the emperor's bizarre fashion whims, and it was a step too far for many. Beyond the silks and the scandals, Elagabalus's personal life was, to put it mildly, unconventional, even by the lax standards of some Roman emperors. His highly public and bizarre relationships further cemented his reputation as a ruler unfit for Rome, and they were often inextricably linked to his unconventional attire. This brings us to the emperor's farcical marriage, or rather marriages, which added another layer of bizarre, silk-laden spectacle to his short reign. Imagine the Roman aristocracy, used to strategic political marriages, or at least discreet personal affairs. Elagabalus, however, seemed to revel in public spectacle. He married and divorced several times in quick succession. One of his most scandalous unions was with a former Vestal virgin, Aquilia Severa, as we touched on earlier. This union was considered an unthinkable sacrilege, not just because of her vows of chastity, but also because of the blatant disrespect it showed for Rome's oldest religious traditions. You can almost hear the collective gasp of the city, followed by widespread outrage as news of this sacrilege filtered through the taverns and public baths. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus's personal life was famously recounted by ancient historians, notably Dio Cassius, who portrayed him as wildly promiscuous and scandalous. These accounts, while possibly exaggerated by hostile sources, paint a picture of an emperor who utterly disregarded Roman social norms regarding marriage, gender, and public decorum. His choice to publicly flout these norms was a direct challenge to the very foundations of Roman morality, and his silk-clad appearances at these controversial events only amplified the scandal. And now for a quirky tidbit. Perhaps the most outlandish aspect of Elagabalus's relationships was his apparent marriage to a male chariot driver named Heracles, whom he reportedly referred to as his husband. He even offered immense wealth to any physician who could perform a sex change operation on him, so that he might truly become a woman. While this certainly wasn't about silk directly, one can easily imagine Elagabalus insisting on Heracles being dressed in the finest, perhaps even matching silken garments, further broadcasting his defiance of societal expectations to a shocked populace. Imagine the gossiping at the public baths. Did you hear about the emperor today? And what was his charioteer wearing? Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was truly gender fluid or transgender in a modern sense, or if his actions were primarily a form of extreme rebellion and provocation against Roman conservatism. Regardless of the precise interpretation, his personal life was a public performance, and his choice of attire, particularly silk, was an integral part of that performance. He used fashion not just to express himself, but to shock, challenge, and ultimately alienate those who held traditional Roman values dear. You can almost feel the uncomfortable tension in the air during these bizarre public appearances, the rustle of his silk robes, echoing the uneasy whispers of the crowd. We've journeyed through Elagabalus's personal silk wardrobe, his silken banquets, and even his attempts to drape sacred figures in the shimmering fabric. But all this luxury came at a significant cost, creating the empire's silken burden. This wasn't just about the personal finances of an emperor. It was about the economic strain his insatiable appetite for silk placed on the vast machinery of the Roman Empire. Imagine the sheer logistics involved. We're talking about a continuous, massive demand for a product that was incredibly expensive, sourced from thousands of miles away, and had to be transported across perilous routes. The cost of acquiring the raw silk, the expense of transporting it, the wages for the skilled weavers and dyers, and the sheer volume of new garments Elagabalus seemingly demanded daily. All of this added up to an astronomical sum. This wasn't sustainable, even for an empire as vast and wealthy as Rome. The imperial treasury, which should have been funding legions, public works, and basic administration, was being diverted to satisfy the emperor's textile fetish. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The Roman economy, even at its peak, was always under pressure to fund its vast military, maintain its extensive infrastructure, and support a sprawling bureaucracy. Emperors were expected to be fiscally responsible, or at least appear to be. Elagabalus's profligate spending on luxuries, particularly silk, would have been seen as a drain on resources that could have been used for more pressing imperial needs. It was a visible manifestation of his perceived irresponsibility, a glaring red flag for those concerned with the empire's stability. And now for a quirky tidbit. To fund his lavish lifestyle, Elagabalus reportedly resorted to desperate measures, including debasing the coinage. This meant reducing the amount of precious metal in Roman coins, effectively devaluing them. Imagine trying to buy bread in the market, and suddenly your coins are worth less than they were yesterday, all because the emperor needed more silk tunics. It's like the ancient world's version of inflation caused by someone's shopping addiction. You can almost hear the common people grumbling about the shrinking size of their denarii, connecting it, perhaps vaguely, to the shimmering robes of their distant, detached emperor. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus's spending on silk and other luxuries genuinely crippled the Roman economy, or if it was simply a symptom of deeper, systemic financial issues already at play in the empire. What is undeniable, however, is that his extreme extravagance was widely perceived as a massive drain on state resources and contributed significantly to his unpopularity among all classes, from the senators to the common soldiers. You can almost feel the weight of this financial burden, the strain on the imperial coffers, all for the sake of a teenager's shimmering obsession. It was a truly peculiar way to run an empire. So, we arrive at the inevitable conclusion of our silken story, the legacy of the Silken Emperor. Elagabalus's reign, though brief, left a peculiar shimmering mark on Roman history, culminating in his dramatic downfall and a posthumous reputation as one of Rome's most scandalous and peculiar emperors. Imagine the atmosphere in Rome in 222 AD. The discontent had simmered for too long. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was paramount, had finally had enough. They were tired of his antics, his perceived effeminacy, his foreign religious practices, and no doubt the sheer un-Romanness of his constant silken display. They had been swayed by his grandmother, Julia Maesa, who, ever the political schemer, had already begun subtly promoting his more palatable cousin, Severus Alexander, as a preferable successor. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Elagabalus was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard in 222 AD, along with his mother, Julia Soaemias. Their bodies were reportedly dragged through the streets of Rome, a final brutal humiliation for the young emperor who had so flagrantly defied Roman norms. His name was officially condemned, a practice known as damnatio memoriae, meaning all records of him were to be erased, his statues torn down. Of course, this rarely worked completely, which is why we're still talking about him tonight. And now for a quirky tidbit. One of the more gruesome accounts states that after his body was dragged through the city, it was thrown into the Tiber River, supposedly so that no trace of him would remain on Roman soil. Imagine the poetic justice, or perhaps simply the grim irony, of a man so obsessed with luxurious fabrics ending up as river flotsam, his silken robes probably snagged on weeds, a final unceremonious farewell to the man who tried to dress an empire in silk. It truly was an ignoble end for such a flamboyant life. Historians still argue whether Elagabalus was merely a victim of powerful political factions eager for control, or if his extreme personal eccentricities truly made him an unworkable emperor in the Roman system. Regardless, his legacy is one of stark contrast. A powerful emperor reduced to a historical footnote of scandal and oddity, forever remembered not for grand conquests or wise governance, but for his bizarre religious practices, and of course, his unwavering, utterly scandalous love for silk. You can almost feel the quiet return to normalcy, the comforting, if slightly dull, sight of wool and linen reasserting their dominance in the Roman wardrobe. The silken dream, or nightmare, was finally over. Now, as the echoes of ancient Rome fade and the image of a young emperor shimmering in silk dissolves into the mists of history, allow your thoughts to drift. Feel the gentle hum of the night, perhaps the soft breath of a fan, as the day's concerns begin to soften and blur. The long journeys of silk, the stern laws of Rome, the eccentricities of an emperor, all become part of a larger, calming tapestry of time. Let the quiet rhythm of ancient stories guide you, easing your mind from its waking thoughts. The distant clatter of a Roman loom, the faint scent of foreign spices, the whisper of silk against marble floors. Let these sounds and sensations lull you. There's nothing left to do now but sink deeper into the stillness, letting your body become heavy, your breath slow and even. Allow the subtle warmth of your covers to embrace you as you drift further and further into a peaceful, dreamless sleep.